performance. This video will be about fitting the main bearings in the 383. Now, this is going to be pretty much applied to any engine. It does not matter if it's a small block Chevrolet, big block, Ford, Mopar, Pontiac, Buick, Olds, done them all, do them all the same way. The only difference is clearance, what you would maybe run on one to another one, stock, mild, high performance application. Bearings have clearances, and depending on what you're going to use it for, usually we like to try to fit them closer to the clearance that we want to see. Now, I won't get into that, but I will get into bearings a little bit, excuse me, and in fitting them. And now on this particular block, I had to line bore it. It was horrible. Somebody actually took the wrong caps and put them on the block, and they were hanging over, and they took a grinder and they ground the caps so they could put bearings in it. The crush was wrong. Everything was wrong. So 1 and 5 are the original, and if you ever get into a block that's missing the caps, number 5 on a Chevy is pretty important because that's the thrust. And if you put the cap on crooked, the thrust will be off. So you always want to make sure that at least if you ever find a block and it's used, you want to really make sure that number 5 is the original cap. Either that or you have to do and measure and check and play around with the cap to get the thrust, because if you cut the cap wrong, and depending on whether it's machined crooked up or down from the factory, it can affect the end play. I won't get into end play too much, but I will tell you something about end play. When you put a lot of power through an engine, the crank can do this. And it will do that a little bit. You know, in a perfect world, it wouldn't do that, but of course it will. So, you know, on thrust, I look at thrust a little differently than most people. For mild to stock application and thrust end play, can be a little bit tight. But when they start getting cranked up and under high boost, I want a little bit more end play. And why do I want more end play? Because I want to make sure that I'm getting oil there. Now, there's a fine line between getting too much end play and just, you know, basically shearing or hammering the oil off of it. There's ways to pressurize to make sure that oil gets to the back bearing. And I may go over that. I've seen a guy said that he drilled a hole to pressurize to put oil up on the face. Different bearing companies go about it differently. Some people put a groove in it. Some people add more grooves. Some people try to ramp the oil up on a wedge. Some companies will back cut the parting line so it's not really flat on the parting line on the top and the bottom of the bearing. That'll allow more oil in there. I've gone in and I've cut them a little bit on the parting line and allowed more oil to get up on the thrust. At the end of the day, there's 1,000 ways you could probably do it, but I'm under the impression that after all the years that I've done this, which every day is a learning day, the little extra clearance on something that's going to get the living bejesus beat the hell out of it isn't the end of the day. So, you know, we won't get into that too much, but there's a proper way of doing that if you want to control and adjust that. Now, if it's too tight, that's not so bad. If it's too loose, well, that's another problem. We'll get into that maybe a little bit more in this video. But if the cap, you can offset the cap a little bit. If it's doweled or pinned, well, then that's out. You can't really do that much unless you want to modify where the pin is. Now, you can offset it. Now, typically, a lot of foreign cars only use 1/2 of a thrust, and that you put them on the block. It's a 3-piece bearing. You control the shims of the thrust by the thickness of them. So, if you've got one that's basically 10 thousandths and you want less, then you put a 12 in or whatever. And they sell them basically different thicknesses. And you adjust it with the shims. I use a feeler gauge, which is a shim, to measure the clearance. So with getting way out into the weeds on that, and probably went too far already, we'll get into this. Now, I had some TRWs and some seal powers and another set of cleave lights. Now, these are old. These are very old. These are actually TRW box cleave light made to bearings. I went through 3 sets of bearings to find a good set for this. Now, these bearings aren't very new, but the TRW cleave light, for a while there, they weren't very good. They got better when Mahle or Molly, however you want to pronounce it, took over. Now they're not so good no more. Now, somebody will say, well, I use Kings and Kings are the best, blah, blah, blah. I've used Kings, Federals, I've used everybody's, I've used some that come in a box with nobody's name on them. And I've had problems with them all. Sooner or later, quality control seems like it goes out the window. So, without getting too far into that whole deal, I use a bearing that fits. How about that? And not having to send it back because it's actually delaminating from the backer right in the box. I've seen them, I've used them all. Everybody's got their favorite. I don't have a favorite. My favorite is the ones that fit. Them are my favorite. Now, you get into tri-coat, bimetal bearings, all this. We're not going to get into that. Coated bearings, I like coated bearings. As long as the coating stays on them, I like it. So, our Calico's got some up there, sitting on a set of heads. So we're not going to get into bearing manufacturers and how they're made. You can look that up on the internet. We're getting into clearances. Getting back to this, I line board this block. I know where the clearances are when I line board it, because I line board it. I know how far the bearings are off. Now, I know that the bearings are off because I line board this. But you get into a stack on where tolerances start adding up. They can add up to your favor, or they can be detrimental to your favor. The back bearing on the seal power bearings, they were all excessively loose, and it got worse towards the back. It wouldn't have been bad. You got to make a decision on what you're going to feel acceptable with. You have to have a dial bore gauge. I don't care what one you buy. Plastic gauge ain't going to cut it. Plastic gauge works okay, but if you really want to step your game up, you need a dial bore gauge. I don't give a shit what anybody says on the internet. I've done this long enough. That's the truth. You should have a ball mic. This ball mic does not read intense, but you can read between the lines. This will tell you how far out of whack the bearing is before you even put it in. There's some bearings in there that are 1/2 thousandths, 5/10ths from across the side of or across the bearing shell, just measuring it with that mic, which only reads in thousandths. But I can tell because it's between 0 and 1. When you read the mic, if it's between the next number up, it's going to be 1/2 thousandths, plus or minus. You can understand that. Okay. So, So I used 2 sets of cleave lights to achieve the clearances I want, because every one of them was a little different. Now the seal powers were on the loose side, they would have worked, but what kind of ground me was there was over 1,000 across the back thrust. And I said it was acceptable, and I thought about it overnight. No, it's not acceptable for me, and I know I could have did better, and so that's what I did. I got out all my standard bearings for 350 Chevy that were Cleve-Lites, because I had the most of them, and I juggled a set of bearings through this block to get the clearances and everything for it to come in to be acceptable for where I want it. So I've checked the clearances, and from the sealed power to the TRW, which are Cleve-Lites, this one is basically 2 4/10. That's acceptable. Federals were 2 7/10, still acceptable. This one was 2 5/10, acceptable. This was 2 1/8. This one had a taper of a couple tenths, and of course that dial bore gauge does not read in half thousandths, it reads in tenths, because that's the line bore gauge that I use when I line bore blocks. Typically, when I do a line bore, I'm plus or minus 2/10. Never half a thousandths, never a thousandths. So this one's between 2 and 4, 2 and 3, roughly, close enough. This one's a little bit bigger, and I'm all right with that. This one's bigger by about 3/10. So this one's about 2 7/10, and the back one before was 3, and I measured it. My gauge bottomed out, and I reset the gauge on the Federal. So that Federal was over 3 on one end of the bearing to 3 and over 6/10 on the other side of the bearing. Wasn't going to have that. Now, this bearing here reads 3 and 6/10 at this end and 3 on that end, and you'd say, well, you line bored it wrong. No, I didn't. I've line bored a few blocks. The new bearing that's in there, the Cleve-Lite, is 2.83. I can live with that. That's within my acceptable range of that housing bore, and it probably isn't 2/10 off, but that's acceptable. I hope you get some. I hope you learned something out of this video, because I really don't know what to make, but this is what I'm making today. Now, this back oil hole doesn't line up exactly as good as it could on the bottom for oiling. We're going to modify that. I see people get excited. You can treat a bearing like anything else. If you're careful with it, and you can modify them if you know what you're doing. You just got to make sure that whatever you're using, you're not putting a bunch of sparks or aluminum shavings. If that bearing is made out of aluminum, Babbitt type aluminum material, that you're not impregnating the surface with it, you know, to tear up the bearing. So if you're drilling it or modifying it, you want to be careful of that. You want to make sure that they're clean, very clean, and there's no sharp edges on them that the crank can catch. Now, the backer of the bearing is steel, so when you open up a bearing, you should be careful, and if you can, you want to drill through the back of it, so you're cutting through the bearing and it's dropping down away from the Babbitt material. That's not always going to happen, but in this particular situation, I'm going to take a jeweler file and I'm going to open this up. So I'm not going to use a high-speed drill or anything that's going to cause a sharp burr or something that I've got to worry about it maybe getting hot and sticking into the bearing material. So we're going to modify that. Now I'm going to check the thrust, and I'll show you how I check it. And there's a reason why I don't use a dial indicator. A dial indicator ain't going to tell you nothing about a thrust. It's going to tell you where it's setting on the block. Dial indicator don't do shit. I see guys use dial indicators to adjust their end play. I think it's humorous, but if you're doing it that way and you like that way, God bless you. It's not going to tell you where the thrust is. It's only going to tell you what clearance you have. With a feeler gauge, you can go from the bottom to the top. You can feel it. You can measure it. So if it's 10 at the bottom and it feels loose at the top, then you can maybe adjust the cap. There's a proper way to do that. Sometimes you can do it if they're on a dowel or a pin. You don't have much room, but sometimes you can wiggle them a bit. It's important that you set the bottom and the top thrust. Now, I was saying that on an import, a lot of them only run on one half of the thrust. So they only have one part, like a Chevrolet. And most automotive engines, other than the little foreign engines, they have two halves of the flange bearing, an upper and a lower. You want to make sure that you're riding on both of them. It's not the end of the day if you're not. If you have excessive end play, sometimes you can shift the cap a little bit, and that'll allow you to tighten up an excessive amount of end play. But, what is an excessive amount of end play? Well, anything past 10 is starting to get to be an excessive amount of end play. So, that's a decision that you'll have to make. But getting back to adjusting the end play with a dial indicator, that's just going to hit, when you bounce it back and forth or you move it back and forth, that's just going to tell you the high spot. It's not going to tell you the whole story. And you don't use a belt sander to adjust the end play on these bearings. Most of it is exposed bronze material that you can lightly sand on a flat block. Wet sandpaper 600 works really well. You make the dimension of the shell and then you sand it until you get the dimension that you want. I may show that, I may not. So this is kind of an experimental video. There's a lot of talking in it, and people might agree or not agree with me. I might get a lot of comments on this video. That's okay. Don't waste your time telling me how you do it. If you feel that you do it my way and you want to say, that's the way I do it, that's great. I've been doing this for 40 years, doing it this way, and I'm going to keep doing it this way. If you think it's wrong, great. I've got a lot of engines out there. I haven't had any problem with end play. I haven't had any problems with where I put my bearing clearances. The only problem I've ever had with people is when they forget to put the oil in the engine. Said I was going to modify this back bearing because the hole isn't quite where it could be. We're going to hit it with a file. Show you where we're at on it. I don't know if you can see right there. So I'm going to take care of that now. I got ahead of myself a little bit. That's okay. I'm going to take a rifle file, jeweler's file, whatever you want to call them, and show you what we're going to do. I'm going to use a round file. I'm going to do it away from the engine. We'll do it over here. Okay. Got it marked. Round file. The hole can be bigger. You don't want to get too crazy, but it's better to have it be a little bit on the bigger side than too small and restricting it. So we've filed it, you can see it's turning into a teardrop. These are very sharp. You don't want to jab yourself with them. They don't feel good. They work much better on skin than they do on steel and aluminum. So I'm going to call that good. See, I've opened it up a little bit. I'm going to break it. I'm going to deburr it. I'm going to wash it. So I've got the backside lightly polished back with a stone. We'll clean it up and we'll get her back in. Okay. You tighten this up to about 15 to 20 pounds, the back bolts. Take a lead hammer or a piece of aluminum, preferably aluminum bronze. You set it on the nose of the crank and you tap it back, give it a good sound whack. I mean, you don't want to, hit it like it owes you money, but give it a firm hit. And that'll set the cap. Then you're going to take you can use a screwdriver or a wedge. You would take a wedge like this or a screwdriver, a big screwdriver, and you put it in between I put it between the number 2 position because there's a counterweight up against it. Give it a firm tap. Then you go in there with a feeler gauge, and you should be anywhere from 4 to 8. Being that this engine is not a high-performance engine, but a mild street engine. So, I didn't mention, when you hit it this way, first you want to tap it that way. Now this is a pinned cap, so chances are you're not going to move it very much. But you can take a piece of bronze or a piece of aluminum and hit it with a hammer. I didn't say a hammer. Obviously that's what you're going to want to do. So we're shooting for 4 to 8. Now 8's on the high side, like I said. So we're going to check it with a 4. The 4 goes right through, fine. So 4 is fine. And I can feel, all the points of the cap. And if you found a spot that was a little tight, you could sand it on the cap and use a micrometer. I'll show you how I do that with an old cap because I didn't really have to do that to this one. I'm going to leave it. It's basically a little bit looser than 4, and it's just a nice 5. So we'll call it 5. I can live with that. And then of course you torque the cap off. I have an old thrust bearing here. It's a big block and it's actually been modified for a little more oil. You can see they put sipes in it. So you'd take a mic and you'd mic your bearing, flange, thrust. Now, when the crank gets applied, it's going to go forwards towards the engine. So this is the side you're going to want to sand. We'll just call it this side. But you want, if you're only looking for 1/1000, it probably really wouldn't matter which side you took it off of. But if you're hunting for more, and you mic it, and you figure out what size you've got. And when you mic these, don't be surprised if you find out that they're not perfect, because sometimes they're not. This one isn't bad. Okay, so we know this is just, I'm looking at the last number, we're at 16. So we know we're at 16. So if you have to take a little bit off of it, or if you've got a tight spot, you can kind of hold it. Now this is 1200 grit sandpaper. This is a piece of used paper. But let's just hold it. This is a ground and lapped flat plate. We'll hold it here and just kind of work it back and forth. And you can see it takes it off pretty decent. Okay, that little bit we've taken very little off of it. But you don't want to use anything really aggressive. You don't want to tear it up. So that's going to increase your oil clearance if you get into a situation where you need to do that. It's not uncommon on engines with a number 3 position thrust, or a thrust in the middle of the crank. When the crank arches, it's going to pinch the thrust. So on them types of engines, when they're going for a lot of boost, I open them up. I'm not going to tell you how much, but I open them up a lot more than 5. Okay, so we've taken about 0.5 off of that. Of course, you want to make sure you wash it really good. But that's about it. And you don't need to have a ground and lapped plate like this. You can do it on a piece of granite countertop or any kind of Formica countertop, as long as it's relatively flat. And that's how you do that when you need to open them up for clearance. You don't use a belt sander. I've seen somebody do that and I couldn't believe it. But it isn't rocket science, but you don't use a belt sander to do this. You need a micrometer. This is just a 1-inch micrometer. You can buy these things reasonable all day. You can find somebody that's retired, an old tool maker or an old machinist, I should say, that had, you can buy a lot of them guys' tools when they retire, and you can buy them for pennies on the dollar, and the old stuff's better than the new stuff most all the time. So I didn't get into this video. We were talking about bearings, and I'm just talking about standard size bearings. I didn't get into splitting bearings. I'll get into that maybe in another video shortly. But this is just the difference between bearing manufacturers. On that 383, I showed you a set of Federals, told you the numbers on that. I had some Clevelites, and I went through that. So this is probably going to be it on this video. I hope you got something out of it. Thanks for watching.